The end of the second quarter, and we need to get to grips with the state of the US and global economy. Global trade derailed in Q1, and now apparently has completely fallen off the tracks in the second quarter, as President Trump has turned on America's trading partners, and they've responded in kind. Tit for tat, back and forth, quid pro quo, doesn't matter which phrase you use, it was hard to keep up with the measure and countermeasure that were introduced. After the volatility of Q1, Q2 was a trade whirlwind, and it left us all gasping for breath. Good evening. It's a new quarter for Wall Street, but there are definitely old fears on tech and trade.
Talk of a trade war really is something that can have the power to roil these markets.
Because we have to, because we've been treated very unfairly.
When you have such an unstable president who constantly is meddling with the status quo in a negative way, it's very hard to build confidence.
Please do not hurt trade.
This is the scenario that we've got currently in the war room. If you need this stuff to make your product, well, prices are now up 40%. So, Richard, is it a trade war?
That's clearly the opening shots.
The Eurozone's economy no longer needs emergency support. Investors knew and were expecting a rise in interest rates.
Concerns about changes in trade policy are rising, I think it's fair to say.
Birth means business, people.
No. You scrub up pretty well in real life. You do it? Oh, yay! Oh, no.
Oh, yay! Oh, yay! Oh, yay!
As Donald Trump prepares to meet with one of the world's most brutal dictators, the president continues to rail against American allies and their trade policies.
There's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump.
And today we saw the markets, which went down and continued going down, and they went all the way down.
Nice to see you again, Richard. I remember when you were over at the house, but that's just for you and I.
That is just for you and I. That was a wimpy gavel. Oh, yes, sir. Well done. A good, robust gavel. So every quarter, we're going to look at the big themes. For example, in Q1, it was all about markets, tariffs, and Facebook. In Q2, the themes are very much those of trade, mergers, and aviation. And where better to start as we look at perhaps symbolizing not only America, but symbolizing everything that has happened than Harley-Davidson motorcycles. Think about it. Harley-Davidson has announced it's moving production of certain vehicles from the United States to other parts of the world for those bikes being sent to Europe to beat the 20% tariff that Europe has introduced in a tit-for-tat on steel and aluminium. The US president has already excoriated Harley, saying they've put up the white flag, they've sold out, they've surrendered, and has promised and threatened that he will increase taxes for this. Harley-Davidsons are a symbol of the current situation. Joining me now is Claire Sebastian, here with me in the studio, and Rana Farah is at the Aspen, Colorado. Good to see both of you. Thank you. Start with you, Rana. The theme, the overarching theme of trade and trade wars dominated Q2.
Absolutely. You know, it started with China, it moved to Europe, NAFTA. I mean, this is what's been moving markets. And, you know, I think that we knew we were going to come here. This is what Donald Trump campaigned on. He's certainly lived up to his campaign promises. It's going to be very interesting to see whether he remains in a war with allies and countries like China, which, you know, the U.S. I think has legitimate trade beefs with, all at the same time, and what that's going to mean for the global economy.
And I think in terms of how the markets view this, Richard, we ended the first quarter with many people still thinking, you know, this could be bad, but it's probably a negotiating strategy. And I think as we've started to see things become reality. We've started to see tariffs actually come in. We've started to see real concrete impact on companies like Harley-Davidson. People are starting to think, actually, I don't know, is this a negotiating strategy, or are we actually going to continue to see an escalation here? And that's why the markets continue to be so volatile.
So let's just look at exactly the situation. First of all, you've got steel and aluminium tariffs, which were contained. They've been contained, Rana, except when it comes to China, where you've got the extra 250 billion that may come along. But as between Europe and you've got the question of cars exports. Do you see this situation getting worse?
I do. You know, Claire brings up a great point. Many of us were talking about whether or not this was a negotiating strategy. I don't think it is. I think that at this point, the hawks in the administration, Peter Navarro, the president's economic advisor, Lighthizer, the trade rep, I think that these folks really would like to see a fundamental restructuring of the global economy and some restructuring of supply chains. And so I do think that things are going to get more heated. You know, you have Steve Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, really trying to pull back and represent the neoliberal arm, but I don't see that working.
Well, Claire, what are companies telling you, those you're speaking to?
Well, this is really interesting, Richard, because I've been speaking to some, we've obviously seen with bigger companies like Harley-Davidson. We know that Brown-Forman, the maker of Jack Daniels, they told me that they are raising prices in Europe. That is the choice companies face: either move production at the moment if they're going to get hit by tariffs, or raise prices. But
or eat the margins.
Or eat the margins, right.
Yes.
But that could hit their brands as well. So, and you know, their bottom line. But smaller businesses are also starting to feel this, Richard, because tariffs are an inflationary pressure, and this comes at a time when the economy is growing, when we're starting to see, you know, full employment hitting. People are starting to see labor shortages. They're having to pay more anyway. Then add into that material costs are rising for manufacturing companies in particular, and you have a situation where they're having to, you know, cut the amount of time that they'll quote companies certain prices. They're having to make changes to their business model, even if they're not at the stage of layoffs yet.
Rana.
You know, I want to add, too, if I might, just picking up on what Claire says, I think that companies are really feeling the heat, and you can see it in the bond markets, Richard. This is something to really look at, this inverted yield curve, this notion that short-term and long-term yields are coming closer. Long-term yields, it's looking like interest rates, the markets think interest rates are going to be lower long-term. That means that they think growth is going to be slower. We might even be going into a recession. So the markets are taking all this very seriously.
Rana, thank you. We'll be back with you in Q3. Well, hopefully we'll be back with you before Q3. And same for you, Claire Sebastian. Indeed, some sobering thoughts on the trade situation. As we continue after the break on the quarterly report, AT&T and Time Warner take on the government and win the go-ahead for a mega merger, which has now reshaped the media landscape. Thank you.